All right, welcome to ICommunicate. It's good to be here this Thursday, and boy, do I have a treat for our listeners today. This is crazy. Now, we know this is a show about communication and being a more effective and confident communicator in the workplace, meaning, in sales situations, leadership, building teams, motivating people, so on and so forth. And I have an environmental science expert today, and you must be saying, what the heck do you have an environmental science expert on the show for? Well, let me tell you, this guy is so talented that he made himself, he adapted to becoming an environmental science expert, and now he's a sales expert. So this guy, who is this multi-talented guy? I had to get him on the show. Jim Keogh, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mark. You're too kind.
So Jim Keogh, local guy, Clark University graduate, go Clark, and he is a commercial real estate specialist for Glickman, Covago, and Jacobs in Worcester. And, one of the reasons I wanted Jim on the show today is we're hearing a lot of buzz right now about, with all the remote structures and work environments, that office space is going to go by the boards, and, what's the future of commercial office space look like? So we're going to talk about that and get on the show. But, Jim, before we do that, I really want to start about where I kind of joked and led. I mean, you go to Clark. You're an environmental science major. How do you go from environmental science to sales? How does that happen?
Yeah, it's a long trajectory, a long story, Mark. We probably need more than the allotted hour to dissect it all. But really, I still love science. I definitely saw that as my path forward. But after getting out of school and trying a couple different things, I sort of realized that my skill set would be more effective in a role such as sales, and sort of the one that I'm in right now. And spent some time in a hospital, was looking for jobs in environmental science, and life happens in mysterious ways, and I sort of ended up here, and I couldn't be more thankful for that. So.
Yeah, and so one of the things that really appealed to me, I've been working with Jimmy, and one of the things that appeals to me about him as a human and as a salesperson is he really has a drive and passion to be better, and not just better salesperson, better human being, a better professional. And we talk a lot about sales emotional intelligence, Jimmy, and let's talk about being a young sales professional right now. What are some of the challenges that you've experienced being young? We hear a lot about young people say they're not taken seriously as much because they are young and they allegedly don't know and have the credibility and knowledge yet. So what are some of the challenges you faced, and how have you tried to overcome those challenges?
Sure. I think breaking into an industry like commercial real estate, it's sort of there's a lot of older generations or people of the older generation that have been doing this for a long time. So one of the challenges that I found is just sort of finding a way to connect with those individuals on a personal level, and then sort of the day-to-day grind of just kind of tailoring. Like we live. It's no secret we live in a technological world, and our industry, I think now more than ever, is driven through sort of technological channels, and it's sort of like trying to leverage your day-to-day activity through email, through texting, but also making sure that you pick up the phone and call people. I'm a big caller. A lot of people refer to me as an old soul, and for me, that's one of the challenges I found is just sort of like tailoring your sales activity to the recipient of that activity, and a lot of that can vary, or the effectiveness of that can vary based on age.
Yeah, it's interesting, Jim. You talk about referencing an old soul. One of the trends I'm seeing in sales right now is that calling is back in, and that's because people are so inundated and overwhelmed with the email that are coming in that sometimes people are looking to get away from screens, right? They're on screens all the time now. So a call all of a sudden has become a breath of fresh air for a lot of people. And Jim, you and I have talked about it. It really personalizes the connection and the communication between. So a lot of salespeople get intimidated by calls. They don't want the rejection. They don't want the cold. Doesn't bother you?
No, I love calling. I love it. Even just, in talking to my friends, I prefer calling. Just you can get so much more done in such a shorter period of time with a call than you can through the digital communication. And it's funny that you mentioned, you bring up just the nervousness around calling, because I think that's not only relevant to the professional world, but also just personal. I think people in general now, just in their own individual lives outside of the workplace, have a harder time sort of just having normal conversations over the phone. And that's just something that I never want to lose, and it's something that brings me joy to do on a day-to-day basis.
So, Jim, when you make those calls, when you begin, let's talk about self-awareness, one of the aspects of emotional intelligence. What do you know going into those calls? It's a two-part question, right? Prior to the calls and during the calls, what do you need to be self-aware of to keep yourself kind of confident and grounded?
Well, I guess just a little bit of background on the person that you're calling always goes a long way. I mean, you can find so much out about a specific company or, a decision maker, if we're talking in a sales context, just based on what they put on their website, and sort of just finding like little things here and there that you can connect on goes a long way. And then throughout the call, just making sure that you're aware of, something that they might say that indicates a certain need that they might have that can kind of prolong a conversation and turn things into instead of just like, hey, I'm just calling you because I have something I want to offer, it's more of like, hey, how can we help each other and, sort of have a reciprocity between parties. And just listening to just every once in a while, somebody will give you an indication of, a need, whether it's right out the gate or, it's more embedded in what they're saying. Every once in a while, you'll realize that, and it'll generally get you to where you need to go.
Jim, when it comes to, we talked earlier about generational communication. There are 5 different generations in and out of the workplace. You may have to modify your approach in communication to different generations based on preferences. So I'm wondering if you've encountered situations where you feel like either directly or indirectly your credibility has been come into question because of your youthful experience in this profession. And if and when that does happen, how do you or how have you handled it?
Yeah, it's certainly happened, and I don't blame anybody for questioning the youth of a new guy into the industry versus somebody who's had 15 years experience in the industry. But I think often, when people find success in an industry like mine, they end up, and I'm not speaking for all people, but there are a lot of brokers, for instance, who after years and years of success, they sort of tend to kind of lay back a little bit. Whereas somebody who's fresh into the industry is hungry, and they're the right level of hungry. They'll provide the service that, somebody who's 15 years down the road might not, because, and it's no indictment on them. It's just maybe they're working on bigger deals now because they're well established. They've got more on their plate. Whereas somebody who just gets in is willing to go that extra mile to sort of, get it done for the client.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point, Jim. I think the hunger aspect is big, and I think there's a second point on top of that. I think what it comes down to is, from a technology point of view, you're probably more likely to be in touch with the latest and greatest ways to find buyers. If it's someone who's looking for an investment, if it's someone who's selling, then you may have the hunger, and you also may be in touch with the innovation and technology to do so, as opposed to someone who's more complacent, who kind of relies on the old things they used to do and isn't really embracing new technology. So I think it's both, right?
Agree.
So, Jim, I want to talk about the state of office space for a moment, because, so many people have transitioned to work relationships. And one of the trends we've seen in residential real estate is that many people are moving into the suburbs and away from the greater Boston area. And so I remember when I sold my house in Hudson and Hopkinton were 2 of the hottest towns in the area, because people are now embracing and accepting that they're going to be working from home for the present and maybe distant future. So when it comes to commercial office space, what is the outlook? I mean, is the fear justified and all people are saying, oh my God, if I own office space, I'm screwed? Or do we need to calm down a little bit, and will the trend reverse?
I am cautiously optimistic about the future of the office space in general. There have been a lot of reports out there that indicate, in polls, that indicate that the majority of people who are working from home that would normally work in an office would at least like the option, or having the option, of going back into the office, which I think sort of speaks volumes in that there's been a lot of data out there that says people working from home are, generally more happy, or they're more productive, but the numbers sort of tell a different story, in that there's a lot of value in those little interactions that people have around the water cooler in the office space that you just don't get at home. And on top of that, there actually has been a surprisingly high number of new leases that have been manufactured over the past few months. With the vaccinations being rolled out and everything, I am definitely optimistic about office space sort of making a big rebound over the next 6 months to the next year.
Jim, to build on what you're saying, we've seen co-working space, be a trend over the last several years. And it would seem to me, and I haven't researched this, but just intuitively, it would seem to me that because of what you just said, many companies will still want the option. Maybe they don't need 5 days a week of office space or 5 days all day, every day of office space, but they still need space that they can share. So do you foresee a big boom in an uptick of co-working spaces as one of the trends we'll see in the future?
I don't. And the reason being the co-working space model kind of relies on a few key elements that I don't think are necessarily economically savvy. One of them being the fact that they operate on basically subleases of larger space, and it's all very short term. So there's just a lot of, rather than, the nice thing about having a long-term lease from a landlord and a tenant's perspective is just the stability. Whereas with co-working, you're kind of getting a lot of shuffling around, a lot of moving pieces, and a bit more instability, which I think kind of ends up playing against the model more so than anything else.
Awesome. All right, well, we're going to go to our first break. When we come back, Jim's going to give his secrets to cold calling. And Ted's favorite topic. So for Jim Keogh, I'm Mark Altman. We'll be back after the break. Okay, welcome back to ICommunicate, and I'm here with Jim Keogh, a commercial real estate specialist with Glickman, Covago, and Jacobs. And if you'd like to call on the show, Jim has pearls of wisdom to share with you. So the number's 508-871-7000. And Ted, what are you doing?
I'm right here.
You're not on cue. I just said the number. Where are you here?
Oh, what's that number?
508-871-7000.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ted. All right, so anyway, we're going to talk about lead generation. And what's funny about this, Jim, and I don't know if I've ever shared this with you, but I do a lot of private coaching for entrepreneurs and sales executives. But let's focus on the entrepreneur piece, because let's face it, Jim, you are an up-and-coming entrepreneur as well. So here's the thing, right, Jimmy, this is what I'll ask him. One of the first questions I'll ever ask him is, talk to me a little bit about your lead generation strategy. Crickets. Like, what do you mean lead generation strategy? I'm like how you get new business? And so this to me is a real polarizing topic, because there's multiple ways. For those of you who aren't doing we're all salespeople. We always talk about that on the show. Everybody's a salesperson, right? But there's so many ways to generate leads. And just to rattle off a few to set Jimmy up here, you've got networking, you've got client calls, past client calls to get referrals. You've got LinkedIn, social media. You've got alumni from school. The list goes on and on. But then you have cold calling. And Jimmy, you are one of the few people I've met who not only, you said it earlier, you like the calls. You embrace the calls. And by the way, Ted, here's something about Jimmy that's pretty cool. Jimmy is so confident and comfortable, not overconfident, by the way, confident and comfortable. He likes to cold walk, right?
Well, somebody trained him well, because every time you go on a visit, you got to hit 5 doors around that visit.
Yep.
And just say, hi, hello, here I am.
So now this is pre-COVID. Of course, Jimmy hasn't had any chances to cold walk during the COVID.
But Jimmy, they didn't give you a mask, buddy? I got some extras here.
So Jim, you could, here's my first question for you. You're a confident cold caller and cold walker. I know you believe in it. So you're telling me that you make 50 calls, okay, and you might only get 2 conversations on those 50 calls. And let's say it took you an hour and a half to make 50 calls, or maybe even 2 hours. You're telling me that after 30 calls, when no one's picking up the phone and you're leaving voicemails, or people are saying, I'm not interested, you're like, that's cool. Next. Is that your mentality?
Well, no, but I would say definitely that, like my desire to make another 50 calls after that really depends on the mood. I'm a big believer in cold calling, but I'm also a big believer in, making the calls when you're in the right mindset to make the calls.
Oh.
So if I make 50 calls, I had a few good conversations and I'm feeling good, yeah, let's make another 50 more. But, if I got rejected a bunch of times and I'm just, I've had it, then I think it's way more effective to come in the next day, brown-eyed and bushy-tailed and make 50 calls when I'm in the right mindset.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a very mature point. As a matter of fact, it doesn't even have to be the next day. It could be 2 hours later, 4 hours. But Jim, that's huge, because self-awareness, right, is, hey, I'm losing my passion to do this right now because the rejection's getting to me. So, Jim, you know that I'm a big fan of when it comes to any kind of calls, cold calls, warm calls, I'm about conversations and not amount of calls. So how do you measure success? And you and I have worked together on this, but how do you, when you make those calls, if you were to make 50 calls and I would call you up after and I said, Jimmy, how'd you do? How'd it go? What are your own metrics to say, I did good, I did okay, I did bad? How do you define that?
There's a bunch of different criteria that I use, but the best call is one where you end up booking an appointment, right? You get to go meet the person in person, have a discussion about the topic that you both want to talk about, and it actually leads to something constructive and concrete. But that doesn't happen every day. I mean, it's the percentage of calls where that is the end result is very tiny. So we've developed these tiered wins where you don't end up getting an appointment right out the gate, but hey, yeah, you can call me back in a week, and sure, this is definitely a conversation I'd like to have at some point. Let's feel free to keep following up with me, or I've got plans to make this move in a couple months, like check in, things of that nature. Or maybe they said oh, we're not really looking at this time, but it actually happened to be a good conversation. It was a good contact. You ended up getting some contact information for them. You stay in touch, and then maybe in a year, who knows? Maybe they have a need, and you've stayed, top of mind. And that's all because on that one day when you made the call, you kept a positive attitude, you had a nice conversation, and things worked out for the better on that one day.
So it sounds like, Jim, what you're saying is you're doing a really good job setting expectations for yourself when you make these calls, right? Because if you're in sales and you're a cold caller and your only barometer for success is I made an appointment, you're going to be upset more often than you're happy, right?
It's a dark place.
Ted, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've got to compliment your guest because he used the one word that this is all about: need. You can close for appointments. You can close for opportunity to call back. You can close for some future requirement, but it comes to need. And one of the things, I don't know if your generation does it the way we used to. We used to carry a bat with us.
Did you walk uphill both ways
both
to school
ways
in
to
the
school?
snow?
Absolutely.
Okay,
In blizzards, sorry.
In blizzards, okay.
And if somebody said to me, I'm not interested, I would say, how do you know? Let's focus on whether you have a need or not, so I'm not wasting my time. Now, swinging the bat like that requires a certain personality, but it's going to cut through the, what's the polite expression? Malarkey. Okay, it's going to get right to the point.
Well, so,
and most people who are CEOs or in a position to write $20,000 checks are going to be saying, oh, he's asking me if I know if I have a need. And they're going to stop and talk to you and have a conversation.
So let's pick up on exactly what Ted said there, Jimmy. So Ted says, someone says, I'm not interested, and you say, how do you know, right? The key to what Ted said is he's talking about assertive sales behavior, right? Which so many salespeople struggle to be assertive in those situations. So to me, let's do this for our listeners, Jim. That question, how do you know? It all comes down to the tone and how you deliver the question, right? Because you're like, how do you know? Right? That's kind of skeptical, like questioning, like, how do you know? So this is why tone is so important in communication. It has to be a curious tone, right? It has to be. So you have to have that curious tone. So, hey, so it would be something like this, Jim. Tell me if you'd be comfortable with this. It'd be like, so I'm not interested. Okay, I can respect that. I'm just curious, like, how do you know if you're interested? Because we really haven't talked about, right? It has to be kind of a tone like that. And see, part of this is, Jim, when you're getting rejected, because Ted's point is so powerful, when you're getting rejected, to maintain the right tone in word choice after someone's telling you they're not interested, and to not personalize it, to make it seem like they're not interested in you as opposed to the product, it's pretty hard, right?
It is hard, and it's especially hard for me sometimes because I tend to have this bellowing voice that my parents would always joke with me that I'm way louder than I think I am, and I say things louder than maybe some things people don't want to hear. But so for me, it's like having to change that tone on the fly to match the person's form of communication. is everything, and it's just something that I always am trying to check myself to stay aware of, as I go through those calls.
Well, and that's the self-control aspect of motivation, of emotional intelligence, right? Because you have to recognize, be aware, and then you have to modify, react, or respond differently based on what the person's doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, when we come back, we're going to pick right up on this, and we're going to talk a little bit about that need aspect that Ted brought up, and how, Jimmy, you do a great job vetting out the need from the prospect in situations like that. So for Jim Keogh, I am Mark Altman for ICommunicate. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back to ICommunicate. I'm here with Jim Keogh, a commercial real estate specialist of Glickman, Covago, Jacobs. And listen, before I get back into this topic, I just need to tell you guys something. One of my favorite things to do in life is watch comedy. I mean, I love comedians, okay? And my two favorite comedians are Brian Regan and Gary Goldman. Okay, and if you haven't listened to those guys, your life is incomplete. However, I have recently stumbled upon a comedian that's been around for at least the last 10, 15 years. I don't know where this guy's been all my life, but I roll when I listen to this guy. Have either of you ever heard of Sebastian Maniscalco?
Yes.
Jimmy, you like him?
Yeah, he's hilarious.
He's hilarious,
yeah.
right? He's so good. So if you have not listened to Sebastian Maniscalco, stop what you're doing. He talks about mainstream stuff that everybody deals with, and I've been listening to him the last few weeks, and I just roll. It's a perfect way to end the day.
Goldman's great, too.
He is, right?
Yeah, he's awesome.
All right, so, Jim, let's get back to, we were talking about, I want to pick up the point Ted, both you and Ted made as we were heading to break. We were talking about the whole thing about establishing need and being assertive, and Ted posed the question, I'm not interested, how do you know? And there's another thing, Jimmy, you and I have talked about in the past, and it's when someone says, and you brought it up earlier on the show, if you're talking to someone, we talked about different wins you can get from cold calling. And the person says, yeah, that sounds good. Why don't you give me a call back in a week, a month, or 2 months, or whatever? And we've talked about even that situation. The assertive question to ask is, what would be different then, right? So Ted, right, if someone says, call me back in a week, a month, 6 months, are they just putting you off?
It depends. You can tell by the answer to that question.
Right, the follow-up question,
But you
right?
have to ask the question.
Yeah. So, hey, I'm happy to call you back in 2 months.
Let me get back to you.
Yeah. But what would be different? Like, do you think the reason you're not able to talk now, or do you think the project you're working on? So, Jimmy, when it comes to assertiveness, and this is one of the questions, you have choices to make. And in sales, there's so many ups and downs. Do you struggle to be assertive? And if so, do you notice when you're struggling to be assertive?
Yeah, I think that's a struggle that a lot of salespeople go through, is just knowing. I always think back to Bill Belichick's situational football. Almost, I always think of it as a situational thing where there are certain times when being assertive is everything, and it can get you to the finish line. But there are also other times where people don't react well to assertiveness, even if it's respectful assertiveness. So every situation's a little bit different, and it's about playing that situational game of football every day, basically. So I mean, it's definitely tough to deal with the ups and downs. We're all human, right? But if you're not assertive in the situations where you need to be assertive, then you're never going to achieve what you need to.
In the spirit of the question, what's going to be different then? If you're assertive with someone and they push back and you don't push back, you're never going to see them again. That's number one. Number two, I just got to know, if this person is never going to want to do business with you, why would you waste one of your 100 phone calls on that person again, ever in the future? So, I mean, that's where I come from. I love the sound of the flushing toilet because it reminds me of all of the calls I've made that I'll never have to make again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that, Ted, because they're simply just, there are some parties that just don't want to have the conversation at all. They're not interested. They'll never be interested. And, why would you spin your wheels trying to contact that person again when you could redirect that energy, time, effort to, the next lead that may, have an interest in doing business with you. So Gary Vee talks about it a lot. I'm not a huge Gary Vee guy. Mm-hmm. I follow him. I like him. I like what he has to say. But he's a big believer and supporter, and just don't waste your time on the people who have zero interest, and that pretty quickly.
Now, Jim, now that's assertive. That's now, but I want to now see Ted and I, Jim, in the past, we playfully argue about word choice, and Ted just said something that's a prime example where I agree with what he's suggesting, but it's the way he phrased it I don't like. Okay, and what it is he talked about the phrase push back, and see that phrase is exactly what gets in the way of salespeople because that's aggressive. Push back ties in with an aggressive behavior. He didn't mean it aggressively. He meant it assertively. But these are the words we get hung up on in sales of, I don't want to do sales because I don't want to be pushy and aggressive. Well, you don't have to be pushy and aggressive to do sales. You can be assertive. And so when Ted says push back, you know what he really means is, push back by asking a question with the right tone and the right word choice, right?
Yeah, and just piggybacking off of that, I think it's more important now more than ever to make sure that you could have a specific intent, like Ted didn't mean anything aggressive by saying that, but we're kind of the time we're living right now, impact is starting to become a bit more important than intent. So we just keep staying mindful of, while you may not intend to hurt somebody's feelings, there's a huge priority on that right now. So
yeah, well, that's a perfect segue, Jim. Let's talk about capturing a person's attention, right? Because right now there is so much noise in society coming from multiple directions. So talk to our audience a little bit of let's talk about written communication for a minute. What are some things you've employed that when you actually send written communication via email, via LinkedIn, that you're like, hey, here's my strategy to capture people's attention, knowing they're getting 1,000 messages a day?
Yeah, keep it simple. Yeah, I had a teacher in high school. Her name was Mrs. LePain. Shout out Mrs. LePain. I had her for AP Government, and she taught our class the 3 C's of writing: clear, concise, and cogent. And that's a lesson that I've sort of tried to carry into the working world. And maybe I'm not always consciously aware that I'm trying to do that, but keeping it simple. There's, like you said, in an age where we're just constantly being barraged with information at a rapid rate, if you want to get your message across, it's important to keep it simple, keep it short, but to the point, and make sure that there's a lot of value in those 2-3 sentences that you put out there.
So, Jim, I've got some bad news. Normally, cogent would be a word of the day candidate because it's such a great word. But unfortunately, our audience missed. Ted used the word surreptitiously between breaks, and that's really got to beat out cogent. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, surreptitiously. Okay, Jim, but I want to build on that because you told me a story yesterday, and this so impressed me. And the irony of this story, and I want you to convey briefly to the audience, is empathy is one of the primary tools in emotional intelligence and sales. And you were telling me a story, and I was hard on you initially at first because I didn't know the full story. But if you could just kind of paraphrase, I know, and I'll set it up for you. I know you had a customer that had found out they had some medical issues, but could you share with the audience kind of the written communication you conveyed to show your empathy and show your caring of this customer? Because I thought this was a high-level thing you did as well.
Yeah, and it's funny because when I tried to paraphrase it to you, I did a horrible job of conveying the actual message that I sent. And then I read the email, and you said, oh, that's a lot better. But, just, hey, I'm sorry to hear that. I hope everything's okay. And, please let us know if there's anything we can do to help, even outside of the real estate stuff. I mean, just personally, is there anything that we can do to help you through this? And, I hope it turns out in your favor. And luckily it did, so everything's okay.
So I just want to tell our listeners, because Jim was being humble there, I just want to make the point that what he actually did is he put his own needs aside. He's in the middle of a deal. He wants to make the deal like every other salesperson on the planet. But then something came up unexpectedly to hold up the deal. The guy is having some medical issues. So Jim put his need to make a deal aside, and he genuinely showed caring and empathy for the guy and reached out. A lot of you might be listening to the show like, yeah, so what? I do that too. Well, maybe. But what Jimmy didn't do is he didn't bring up the deal in the communication, and he just made himself available and supportive in what the person needed. And I think, Jim, one of the things that I've seen as one of your biggest assets, and I'd love to pick your brain on this, is, we are greatly affected. The way we communicate, the way we lead is greatly affected by the culture we grow up in. It's affected by our boss and our workplace culture. Talk a little bit about some of the ways you've adapted your style and your personality that may be inconsistent with the parenting and the workplace culture you grew up with.
Boy, that's a tough question.
No softballs here on ICommunicate, Ted.
That's a tough question. I would say that well, for one, I have a strong family unit. So I'm forever grateful for that. Loving parents.
Great job, Mom and Dad. Good job.
Great job, Mom. I love you both. And I love my sister. I love her too. My sister and my parents. We're just a tight family. And my mom was always teaching me from a young age to be nice to everybody. And obviously I try and I obviously treat everybody with the same level of respect. But once you get into the industry that I'm in, obviously you treat everybody with respect. But there are times where you can't be textbook nice. You have like Ted was saying, you have to push back a little bit. So that's something that I would say that's probably the most inconsistent part. Was I had to learn that later on in life to sort of just be a bit more assertive, as we've been talking about throughout the whole show. That wasn't something that came so naturally to me, and that's a credit to my parents just being nice people themselves.
Okay, so when we come back for our final segment, what we're going to talk about is, we all know we're supposed to be nice, right? But I'm going to tell you the single biggest key to executing niceness when we come back for our last segment. For Jim Keogh, I'm Mark Altman. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back to ICommunicate. And I just need to tell our listeners, Jim Keogh, this is his first time on the radio. And for a guy who's never been on the radio before, I'm afraid he's going to take my job, Ted. Like, the guy's excelling at all levels here. Like, is my job in jeopardy or what?
Well, I'll be giving him my phone number before you leave.
I don't know if that's the kind of phone number he's looking for, but but I digress. Okay, in any event, so I promised heading into this last segment I would talk about the single biggest key for executing niceness. And what is slowing down enough to remember to be nice. And we talked in the last segment about the story of the prospect that was having some medical issues, and Jim slowed down enough to be nice. And people might be like, well, what do you mean slow down? What I mean is, we're going so fast all day, every day, attending meetings, making calls, having conversations, doing tasks, doing projects, doing busy work, that there are certain things that are so obvious that we don't slow down enough to remember to do. And so I think when your mother said it's important to be nice to everyone, your biggest challenge is that to be true now. She ingrained that in you. But now it's up to you to remember to slow down enough to take the time to do it, because that's really and time's our biggest enemy to everything right now. So I want to go back to, we talked about lead generation earlier in the show, and I have to ask you, Tim. Is it Friday, Ted?
I've got the Twilight Zone sound effect
Seriously.
Over here. Would you like me to?
At least I had the second two letters of his name right now. All right, Jim, so I have to ask you, I want to talk to you about social media and LinkedIn a little bit. We talked about cold calling, and I want to ask you, to me, LinkedIn is the most important social media channel for you. It's the most valuable for you to leverage relationships and build as a young professional who hasn't built up, thousands of contacts yet. Is it a struggle to really leverage LinkedIn the way you'd like, and what have you done to adapt to that?
So I think, personally, I have a lot of contacts, but I think I have a lot of connections, I should say. But I think if
good differentiator right there.
Yeah, right.
Well done.
I think if there's one tip I could give everybody is just to start early on LinkedIn. Now that, when I was in college, it was sort of starting to become more and more prominent and useful as a tool. But I would just say definitely start building that network early when you're in school and you've kind of started to figure out where your professional path might take you. I think the most challenging part about leveraging LinkedIn is once you get to a certain point, you just have so many connections that a lot of them are, I don't want to say worthless, but they're just
don't remember why you connected with them in the first place.
Exactly, yeah. And you know that you don't even know their names. Some of them, you're like, who's this person? And and maybe 3 years ago there was some sort of synergy there where the person thought to reach out, or you thought to reach out, but I kind of view a lot of social media as a necessary evil in that I don't like to spend a lot of time on it per se, but I understand how it's a useful tool to get you where you need to go. To answer your question, I definitely think that the most challenging part of leveraging LinkedIn is just finding the right contacts in your network to sort of, make different plays based on what you're hoping to achieve.
Yeah, Jim, I actually think one of the challenges, and I don't think it's a generational thing. I think all generations struggle with this. It's in sales, when you're reaching out to leads, you have a very specific agenda in mind. In your business in commercial real estate, I'm calling because I have a listing. I'm calling because I have an investment opportunity. I'm calling because you wanted to sell and I may have a buyer. It's very cut and dry, the purpose of the call. But with LinkedIn, when you have contacts or connections, it's not always clear because you don't know what their interest would be and how they could help. And I think, to me, Jim, that's the biggest deterrent for people when they're using social media channels such as LinkedIn. If you reach out to John Smith on LinkedIn, and let's just pretend John Smith is, let's go doctor. Let's say John Smith is a doctor. You're like, why the heck would I reach out to John Smith? He's a doctor. Well, we don't have any idea of John Smith's interest in investing in commercial real estate. I mean, maybe because he makes so much money or she makes so much money, they would like to invest in commercial real estate. But I do think, Jim, that's one of the biggest struggles is there's not a clear path in many cases when you're making those reach outs on LinkedIn. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. I mean, just to go off of that example too, I mean, you also don't know what sorts of patients John Smith is dealing with that would have an interest in investing in commercial. Now we're getting into HIPAA laws, of course. You can't disclose, the conversations that he has with his patients, but you just never know. That's why we all, whenever I talk about referrals with my friends or whoever, some of the best the channel referral partners are the barbers or just people that see others all the time and are always there. It's like their job is to cut hair, but they're also having conversations. They have the ins, the bartenders, people like that. So it's always just like trying to find that creative way of communicating with people and often through indirect channels.
Jim, for the people you serve, let's take, I'm an investor and I want to invest in some office space. What are some quick tips you could give someone who already is an existing investor or who's considering getting an investment? Like, what are some tips you would advise that if you were serving them as the broker and you were working with them, that you would say, hey, these are the top things I would keep in mind based on where we are today?
Definitely make sure you have a strong lease in place. I mean, if you're talking about an investment property in particular, an office investor, you have to make sure that those leases are rock solid. I've been working with a buyer lately at a high level. He's looking for some government investment properties throughout the country. And a lot of the opportunities that that have been in front of us or put in front of us, they seem to be really great. But then once we get into the actual, language of the lease, there's all these problems. There's termination clauses. There aren't, annual escalations in the rent. There's just issues. So I think if I can make one suggestion to an investment or to an investor looking for an investment property, specifically an office, is definitely make sure that those leases are rock solid and they protect you as the landlord more than they protect the tenant as the tenant. If that makes sense.
It does. One last thought, Jim, today in our final thing is I want to talk about reactive versus proactive. And as a past graduate from Clark who's been in the professional realm for a few years now, when it comes to reactive habits and behaviors as opposed to proactive habits and behaviors, what's some advice you could give young people who may be reactive in how they plan their day, and that some transitions you've made to be more proactive?
Yeah, it's an interesting conundrum because when you're first starting out in a new business, especially like commercial real estate, you're just learning all the time. That's all you're doing is learning, and you're getting helped out a little bit here and there, and it's so easy to lose track of time 6 months later because 6 months later you've built up some small book of business. You're starting to work some deals, and people are coming to you with their needs. And out of nowhere, it can get a little out of control with the way you manage your time. So something I've done is I've just started planning on my days before the days happen, and it's made all the difference. Whereas when I was first starting out and I was still learning, I would have an idea of what I was going to do, and I'd block out specific periods of time. But things come up every once in a while that you have to deal with, and it's about prioritization and time management ultimately.
Jim, how long does it take you to plan your day?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, everybody. What a thought. Planning, the P's. He talked about the C's earlier. Planning, preparation. So, Jim,
Jim, do you write that plan down?
All the time.
Yeah, so to me, it's such a simple tip, but sometimes the best pieces of advice, like Jim just gave, doesn't have to be complex. It can be simple, and sometimes they're better when they're simple. So good
Make
job.
a plan and write it down.
Right.
And I think just to have the confidence to do it is huge too.
It is. Jim Keogh, you're the best, man. You're welcome back to ICommunicate anytime. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Ted.
All right, Ted, as usual, amazing job being versatile in producing and contributing. For ICommunicate, I'm Mark Altman. We'll see you next time.